April 14, 1865, Good Friday. Washington, D.C. had been celebrating for nearly a week. 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War, 4 years of bloodshed, over 600,000 dead, was finally over. The city was alight with bonfires and celebration. But that night, a single pistol shot would change everything. At approximately 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor, slipped into the presidential box at Ford's Theater. He placed a single-shot Derringer pistol against the back of President Abraham Lincoln's head and fired. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear, passed through his brain, and lodged just behind his right eye. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. in a small boarding house across the street from the theater. That is the story most Americans know. An actor, a fanatic, a single shot, a president dead. But here is where the mystery begins. What most people do not realize is that Lincoln's assassination was never supposed to happen that night. It was not even supposed to be an assassination. Booth's original plan, the plan he had been working on for nearly 8 months, was to kidnap Lincoln, not kill him. He wanted to hold the president hostage and ransom him for the release of Confederate prisoners of war. The murder at Ford's Theater was improvised, and that improvisation is the first clue that something far deeper was at work. Within hours of the shooting, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took personal control of the investigation. Stanton was a man of extraordinary power. He ran the War Department with an iron fist, and during Lincoln's presidency, he had become one of the most influential figures in Washington. On the night of April 14th, Stanton essentially seized control of the federal government. He ordered the telegraph lines shut down. He dispatched military troops across the city. He personally interrogated witnesses. And he began a manhunt that would become the largest in American history. But here is where the historical record becomes strange. Stanton did something that night that has puzzled historians for generations. He ordered that Booth's body, if captured, be brought to the Navy Yard rather than to the War Department. He then ordered the destruction of the telegraph records from that evening, claiming they were irrelevant. He prevented certain witnesses from testifying at the subsequent trial, and he never allowed the military commission to question him about his own actions that night. Why would the man in charge of the investigation behave in ways that seemed designed to conceal rather than reveal? Why destroy evidence in the hours after a president has been assassinated? Why prevent key witnesses from testifying? These questions are not new. In fact, they have been asked for over 150 years. But the answers historians have given are surprisingly unsatisfying. Let us look more closely at what actually happened inside Ford's Theater. The presidential box was supposed to be guarded that night. Lincoln's bodyguard, a Metropolitan Police officer named John Parker, had been assigned to protect the president. But Parker was not at his post when Booth entered the box. Earlier that evening, Parker had gone to a nearby saloon. He had left the president unguarded. When Booth approached the box, the only obstacle in his path was a single wooden door. That door had a small peephole. Booth knew the play well. He was an actor who had performed in this very theater. He waited until the audience erupted in laughter during the play's funniest scene, a moment when no one would hear a gunshot. He fired. Then, in one of the most dramatic moments in American history, Booth leaped from the box to the stage below. His spur caught on a flag draped over the box, causing him to land awkwardly and break his leg. He raised his dagger, shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," the Virginia state motto meaning, thus always to tyrants, and escaped through the back of the theatre. The assassination itself is not in dispute. What is in dispute is everything that came after. Because while Booth was escaping, something else was happening, something that has never been fully explained. At the same moment Booth fired his shot, another assassin attacked Secretary of State William Seward at his home. Lewis Powell, a Confederate soldier and Booth co-conspirator, forced his way into Seward's house and stabbed him repeatedly. Seward was severely injured but survived. Powell escaped into the night. This was not a coincidence. Booth had planned a coordinated attack on multiple government leaders. And there was a third target. Booth had assigned George Atzerodt to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood Hotel. But Atzerodt lost his nerve and never carried out the attack. That night, 3 of the most powerful men in the United States government were targeted simultaneously. But here is the question the history books rarely ask. If Booth was simply a lone fanatic with a handful of followers, how did he plan an attack on 3 federal officials, one of them the president, at exactly the same time, across different locations in the city? How did he coordinate this without any assistance beyond a small band of conspirators? And more importantly, who else might have known about the plan? By dawn on April 15th, Washington was in a state of chaos. The president was dead. The Secretary of State was gravely wounded. The vice president had narrowly escaped, and the manhunt for Booth had begun. But the investigation was being run by one man, Edwin Stanton, and he was running it in ways that would later raise more questions than answers. To understand what really happened on April 14, 1865, we have to go back nearly a year. Because the murder of Abraham Lincoln was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was the desperate final move of a man whose original plan had already failed, and whose true motivations have been misunderstood by historians for generations. John Wilkes Booth was not always an assassin. For most of his life, he was one of America's most famous actors. Born into a legendary theatrical family, Booth commanded stages across the country. He was handsome, charismatic, and deeply admired. Women adored him. Critics praised him. He earned more than $20,000 a year, a fortune at the time. By any measure, Booth had everything. But Booth also had a dark obsession. He was a virulent white supremacist and an unapologetic defender of slavery. He hated Abraham Lincoln with an intensity that bordered on madness. Lincoln, in Booth's view, was a tyrant who had destroyed the South and was intent on granting equality to black Americans. Booth believed that Lincoln's true goal was the complete destruction of the white race. This was not a political disagreement. This was a deep, personal, and consuming hatred, and it drove Booth to act. In the summer of 1864, Booth began planning something extraordinary. He was not planning to kill Lincoln, not yet. He was planning to kidnap him. The idea was simple: capture the president, transport him to Richmond, and hold him hostage in exchange for the release of Confederate prisoners of war. These prisoners were being held in Union camps under horrific conditions. Thousands were dying of disease and starvation. Booth believed that by seizing Lincoln, he could force the Union to negotiate. He could bring the Confederacy back to the bargaining table. For 8 months, Booth worked on this plan. He assembled a small network of co-conspirators. Some were Confederate sympathizers, others were just desperate men looking for money. He recruited a former Confederate soldier named Lewis Powell, a coachman named George Atzerodt, a carpenter named David Herold, and an innkeeper named Mary Surratt, whose boarding house became a meeting place for the conspirators. Booth even arranged to have boats waiting on the Potomac River to transport Lincoln south. But the plan kept falling apart. Booth and his men followed Lincoln around Washington, waiting for the right moment. They watched his movements, tracked his carriage, even scouted the roads leading out of the city. But Lincoln was always surrounded by guards. The opportunity never came. Then, on April 9th, everything changed. Robert E. Lee surrendered. The Confederate cause was lost. Booth's kidnapping plan was now useless. There was no government in Richmond to negotiate with. The war was over. And that is when Booth made a fateful decision. If he could not capture Lincoln to save the Confederacy, he would kill him instead. He would strike a blow that would live in history forever. This is the point where the standard narrative ends. Booth, frustrated and fanatical, abandoned his original plan and improvised a new one: murder. But here is what historians rarely emphasize. Booth did not kill Lincoln because he was insane. He was not a madman driven by delusion. He was a rational actor who made a calculated decision. He believed that by killing the president, he could reignite the war. He believed that the Confederacy would rise again. He believed he was a hero. In the days after Lee's surrender, Booth's diary reveals a man gripped by a strange sense of destiny. He wrote that the South had been betrayed by its own leaders, that surrender was a coward's act, and that only a desperate action could save the cause. Lincoln's death, Booth believed, would throw the Union into chaos. The government would collapse. The Confederacy would be reborn. This was not the thinking of a madman. It was the thinking of a fanatic. And fanatics are far more dangerous than madmen, because they believe they are acting with moral purpose. Booth's original plan was to kidnap Lincoln on March 17, 1865, but Lincoln had changed his schedule at the last moment. A few days later, Booth attended a speech in which Lincoln publicly supported voting rights for black soldiers. Booth was enraged. He told a friend, "That means nigger citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through." From that moment, Booth was committed to murder. On the morning of April 14th, Booth learned that Lincoln would be attending a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that night. He immediately knew this was his chance. He gathered his co-conspirators and assigned them their targets. Powell would kill Seward. Atzerodt would kill Johnson. Booth himself would kill Lincoln. But there was a problem. Atzerodt was a coward. He was supposed to be at the Kirkwood Hotel when Johnson arrived, but he lost his nerve. He spent the evening drinking in the hotel bar and never carried out the attack. Powell, meanwhile, brutally attacked Seward, but failed to kill him. Only Booth succeeded. So here is the question that has never been adequately answered. If Booth was the mastermind, why was his plan so badly executed? 2 of the 3 assigned assassins failed. The escape route was poorly planned. Booth and Herold wandered through Maryland and Virginia for 12 days before being cornered. It was not the work of a brilliant strategist. It was the work of a desperate man who had gambled everything and was now running for his life. But there is another possibility, one that historians have argued about for more than a century. What if Booth was not the mastermind at all? What if he was a willing instrument of a far larger conspiracy? Consider this. Booth had been in contact with the Confederate Secret Service. He had ties to Confederate agents operating in Canada. He had met with Confederate officials in Montreal. He had even attempted to coordinate with Confederate generals who had not yet surrendered. The Confederate leadership knew about Booth. Some of them may have encouraged him. In the years after the assassination, evidence emerged that Booth had been funded by Confederate gold, that he had met with Confederate spies in Washington, that his actions were not his own, but part of a larger plot hatched in Richmond. If that is true, then the Lincoln assassination was not just the act of one fanatic. It was the final act of the Confederate war effort, a desperate attempt to destroy the Union by killing its leader. But even that explanation may not go deep enough, because there is another theory, one that implicates someone far more powerful than Booth or the Confederates. Someone who had been in the room when Lincoln died, someone who controlled the investigation, someone who had everything to gain from Lincoln's death. That man was Edwin Stanton. To understand why John Wilkes Booth pulled that trigger, we must understand what he believed. And what he believed was not simply that the Confederacy deserved to win. He believed something far more radical, far more disturbing, and far more revealing about the true origin of Lincoln's murder. Booth was raised in a world where slavery was not just accepted, it was celebrated. His family were Maryland slaveholders. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, had been a famous actor who owned enslaved people. His brother, Edwin Booth, was a Union sympathizer, but John was different. John had inherited the family's property in Maryland, and he had grown up surrounded by the Southern aristocracy. He was a man of the South, and the South to him meant white supremacy. Booth's diary and private letters reveal a man consumed by racial ideology. He wrote openly that Lincoln was a tyrant who intended to destroy the white race. He believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was not a humanitarian act, but a weapon designed to incite a race war. He wrote that Lincoln had turned the country over to the nigger and that white America was being destroyed. These are not exaggerations. They are his own words, written in his own hand. On April 14th, the day of the assassination, Booth attended a public ceremony in Washington. A crowd had gathered to celebrate Lee's surrender. Banners hung from buildings. The city was delirious with joy. But Booth stood in the crowd, silent and angry. He watched as Lincoln's carriage passed by. He saw the president smile and wave, and in that moment he made his decision. But Booth's hatred did not begin with Lincoln. It began with his belief that the South had been betrayed. He saw secession as a noble cause. He saw slavery as a divine institution. He saw black Americans as inferior and unfit for freedom. These were not fringe beliefs in the 1860s. They were mainstream in the South. But Booth was not content to hold these beliefs quietly. He was willing to kill for them. What historians often overlook is that Booth was not alone in this hatred. The assassination of Lincoln was not a solitary act of violence. It was the culmination of a broader movement that rejected equality, rejected emancipation, and rejected the very idea of a multiracial democracy. Consider this. After Lincoln's death, millions of Southerners mourned, not for Lincoln, but for the Confederacy. In the South, Booth was celebrated as a hero. Women wore pins bearing his image. Confederate soldiers wrote letters praising his courage. A statue was even erected in his honor. The South did not see Booth as a murderer. They saw him as a martyr. This context is critical, because when historians ask what truly caused the Lincoln assassination, the answer is not simply Booth's fanaticism. The answer is the system of white supremacy that created Booth and his supporters. The assassination was not just a crime. It was the final explosion of a society built on racial domination. Booth himself understood this. In his diary, written while fleeing from federal troops, he justified his actions by invoking history. He compared himself to Brutus, who killed Caesar to save Rome. He saw himself as a liberator, not a killer. He wrote that he would be remembered by history as a hero, and in the South, for generations, he was. But here is the disturbing truth that historians have uncovered. Booth's racial ideology was not just his own personal belief. It was shared by many of the most powerful men in the Confederacy. It was shared by Confederate generals, politicians, and even some members of the United States government. Slavery was not just an economic system, it was a worldview, and that worldview was willing to kill to survive. Booth's diary entries from his escape are haunting. He writes of his conviction that he had done the right thing. He writes of his belief that history would vindicate him. He writes of his willingness to die for the cause. In one entry he says, "I have no desire to survive the cause." He fully expected to be captured and executed. He welcomed it. In the end, Booth was cornered in a tobacco barn on a farm in Virginia. Union soldiers surrounded the barn and set it on fire. A Union sergeant shot Booth through the neck. He was paralyzed. He was dragged from the burning barn and laid on the porch of a nearby farmhouse. As he lay dying, he asked for a drink of water. He stared at his hands. He whispered, "Useless, useless." He died 3 hours later. That was Booth's end. A man who died believing he had saved his country. A man who never once expressed regret for what he had done. But let us step back, because Booth, as we have seen, was not a lone wolf. He was part of a network. He had co-conspirators. He had financial backing. He had connections to the Confederacy. So, the question becomes, was Booth simply the visible point of a much larger conspiracy? This is where historians divide. One group, the Orthodox school, argues that Booth and his small group acted alone. They were amateurs who improvised a desperate plan after Lee's surrender. The assassination was tragic, but ultimately the work of a handful of fanatics. Another group, the conspiracy school, argues that Booth was part of a larger plot involving Confederate leaders, European agents, and perhaps even officials in Washington. These theorists point to Booth's connections, the failed attacks on Seward and Johnson, and the extraordinary secrecy surrounding the military trial. And then there is the most explosive theory of all, that the assassination was orchestrated from within the US government itself. That brings us to the trial, a trial that was, in some ways, more revealing than the assassination itself. A trial held behind closed doors, before a military commission, with no jury, no right to counsel, and no civilian oversight. A trial that many historians now believe was designed not to uncover the truth, but to conceal it. So what happened inside that courtroom? And why was the most powerful man in the government, Edwin Stanton, so determined to control every aspect of it? The answer may be more disturbing than the assassination itself. Within hours of Lincoln's death, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had taken control of the federal government. He had ordered the telegraph lines shut down. He had dispatched troops across the city. He had begun interrogating witnesses. And he had made a decision that would shape the historical record for generations. The conspirators would not be tried in a civilian court. They would be tried before a military commission. This decision has haunted historians ever since. Because the military trial that followed was not a conventional legal proceeding. It was something far more troubling and far more revealing about the forces at work in the aftermath of the assassination. On May 10, 1865, a military commission convened at the old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington. 8 defendants sat in the dock, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Loughlin, David Herold, George Atzerodt, Louis Payne, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Edward Spangler, a stagehand at Ford's Theatre, and Mary Surratt, the first woman ever to be executed by the United States government for his Laughlin. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution called 366 witnesses. The evidence presented was voluminous, but the proceedings themselves were deeply irregular. The defendants were tried before a panel of 9 military officers, not a jury of their peers. The rules of evidence were far broader than in a civilian court. The defendants were not permitted to testify on their own behalf, and a conviction required only 5 votes, not the unanimous agreement required in civil trials. The government's justification for this extraordinary procedure was simple. Washington, D.C. was still a war zone in April 1865. Confederate troops were still in the field. The assassination was therefore an act of war, not a civilian crime, and a military commission was the appropriate forum. But critics have argued otherwise for more than 150 years. They point out that the civilian courts in Washington were open and functioning. They argue that the military tribunal was designed not to uncover the truth, but to silence the accused and ensure a swift conviction. Some have gone further, claiming that Secretary Stanton used the trial to cover up his own involvement in the assassination. The evidence for this latter claim is circumstantial but provocative. Consider the case of Mary Surratt, whose boarding house had been used as a meeting place for Booth and his co-conspirators. Her son, John Surratt, was also suspected of involvement in the plot. But John Surratt fled the country and was not apprehended until 1867. When he was finally brought to trial in a civilian court, the jury deadlocked and he was never retried. The contrast was striking. A military commission had condemned his mother to death with relative speed, while a civilian jury could not even reach a verdict against her son. It was easy to conclude that the military trial had been a miscarriage of justice. But historians have pushed back against this narrative. Thomas R. Turner, a leading scholar of the assassination, has argued that the military commission's verdict was probably very similar to what a civilian jury would have rendered in April 1865. The public was consumed with rage. The assassination had unleashed deep emotions. There was no indication that a civil jury would have been any more lenient. In fact, Turner notes, the military tribunal recommended clemency for Mary Surratt, an action that suggests they were not the unfeeling executioners some have portrayed them to be. Turner also defends Stanton's actions in the aftermath of the assassination. He points out that many government officials were paralyzed by the events of April 14th. Chief Justice Salmon Chase was so afraid that he remained at home with guards outside his window, calling it a night of horrors. It was Stanton alone who took charge, alerting military commanders, ascertaining the extent of the plot, and attempting to ensure that the conspiracy did not succeed. Most of Stanton's contemporaries did not believe he was trying to become a dictator. They believed he had done an excellent job under the most trying circumstances imaginable. And yet, there are still unanswered questions. Why did Stanton order that Booth's body, if captured, be brought to the Navy Yard rather than to the War Department? Why did he order the destruction of the telegraph records from that evening? Why did he prevent certain witnesses from testifying at the trial? And why did he never allow the military commission to question him about his own actions that night? One possible answer is that Stanton was not trying to cover up a murder plot. He was trying to cover up something else: the incompetence of his own investigation, or the political machinations of the radical Republicans, or the embarrassing fact that Booth had been able to walk through Washington unopposed. Stanton had been in charge of security. The assassination was a massive failure on his watch. He had every reason to control the narrative. But there is another possibility, one that has been argued by some of the most sensational writers on the subject. The military trial, they contend, was a show trial designed to convict and execute the conspirators before they could reveal who had truly orchestrated the assassination. That possibility has never been entirely dismissed. Consider the testimony of Sanford Conover, a key government witness. Conover claimed to have evidence that Confederate officials in Canada had masterminded the assassination. But after the trial, Conover was convicted of perjury. He had fabricated his testimony, and yet the evidence he provided had helped to convict the conspirators. This is not a minor detail. It suggests that the government's case against the accused was built, at least in part, on lies. The prosecution's case also named Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, as one of the conspirators. The indictment charged that Davis, along with Booth and others, had combined, confederated, and conspired to kill Lincoln. The evidence presented against Davis was thin, but the government's willingness to name the Confederate leader suggests a broader political agenda. The assassination was not just a crime, it was an act of war, and the Confederate government was responsible. This leads us to a deeper question. Why was the trial conducted in such secrecy? Why were the defendants hooded and chained? Why were they denied the basic protections of civilian law? The answer, according to many historians, lies not in a cover-up, but in the overwhelming desire of the government to get to the bottom of the conspiracy. As the New York Times put it at the time, the trial now in progress is not a trial for simple murder. Its object is not merely to punish one or more individuals for a specific act of crime. The government seeks to unravel a conspiracy, to follow every clue that may be offered for the detection and arraignment of every person in any way connected, directly or indirectly, with the extended and formidable conspiracy in which the assassination of the president was only one of the objects sought. But even this justification has been contested. Some have pointed out that the military commission was far less impartial than it appeared. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, who prosecuted the case, also advised the commission on legal questions. Secretary Stanton himself helped draft the charge against the defendants. The prosecutors effectively controlled the trial. This was not a neutral legal proceeding, it was an executive proceeding, through and through. The trial ended on June 30th, 1865. All 8 defendants were found guilty. 4, Powell, Atzerodt, Herold, and Mary Surratt, were sentenced to death. They were hanged on July 7th in the courtyard of the Old Arsenal Penitentiary. It was the largest execution in American history, but the doubts have never fully been laid to rest. The irregularity of the trial, the perjured testimony, the political pressures, the manipulation of evidence, all of it has fed the suspicion that the true story of the Lincoln assassination has never been told. And at the center of that suspicion, for many conspiracy theorists, stands one man, Edwin Stanton. Was Stanton a patriot who served his country in its darkest hour, or was he a calculating figure who orchestrated a cover-up, or worse, to advance his own political ambitions? The next chapter will examine the evidence against Stanton in detail, and what we will discover is that the truth is far more complicated and far more disturbing than either side has been willing to admit. But before we examine the evidence against Stanton more closely, we must confront a scandal that has haunted the assassination investigation for over a century. Because the trial of the conspirators, the trial that sent 4 people to the gallows, was built in part on testimony that was later proven to be a complete and total lie. The government's star witness was a man named Sanford Conover. Conover appeared before the military commission and delivered sensational testimony. He claimed that Confederate officials in Canada had orchestrated the assassination plot. He named names. He provided details. He implicated Jefferson Davis himself. Conover testified that he had been in Montreal when Jacob Thompson, a Confederate agent, showed him dispatches from Richmond that approved the assassination. He claimed that Thompson had personally recruited Booth and that the entire plot was directed from Canada. Conover's testimony was electric. It confirmed everything the public already believed about Southern treachery. It justified the military trial. It made the convictions seem inevitable. But there was one problem. Conover was a serial perjurer, and his lies would eventually unravel the government's entire case. In 1866, Conover was arrested and tried for perjury. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had fabricated his testimony. He had coached other witnesses to lie. He had invented an entire conspiracy because he wanted revenge against Jefferson Davis. According to his confession, Davis had insulted his wife and caused him to be imprisoned during the war. Conover's testimony was not just questionable, it was a deliberate, calculated fraud. His conviction sent shockwaves through Washington. If the government's star witness was a liar, what else had been fabricated? The question was never fully answered, but it planted a seed of doubt that would grow for generations. The perjury scandal had another consequence. It exposed the military trial as a deeply flawed proceeding. The prosecution had relied on false testimony. The defendants had been convicted, in part, on lies. And yet, the government showed no interest in reopening the case. Representative Andrew Rogers, the sole Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, investigated the matter. He cross-examined witnesses and discovered that Conover and his associates had used false names, accepted bribes, and fabricated evidence. The records of the military trial had been sealed in the interest of national security. The files would not be reopened for another 80 years. Rogers wrote a scathing dissent, declaring that the cool turpitude of the whole crew sickened me with shame and made me sorrow over the fact that such people could claim the name American. But the majority report, written by Stanton's friend, Representative George S. Boutwell, ignored the perjuries. It defended the trial, it dismissed the scandal, and the official narrative remained intact. This is where the historical record becomes murky, because once Conover's perjury was exposed, it raised a question that has never been answered. Did Secretary Stanton know that Conover was a perjurer? Was he aware that his prosecution had been built on lies? And if so, why did he allow the trial to proceed? Defenders of Stanton argue that the perjury scandal does not undermine the core of the case against the conspirators. They point out that Conover's testimony was not the only evidence. There were other witnesses, there was physical evidence, there were Booth's own diary entries. But critics are not so easily convinced. They argue that a trial that relies on perjured testimony is not a trial at all. It is a show trial. And a show trial that sends innocent people to the gallows is not justice. It is murder. The case of Mary Surratt illustrates this point. Surratt was the first woman executed by the United States government. Her execution was controversial then, and it remains controversial today. Many historians believe that the evidence against her was weak. She was convicted largely because her son, John Surratt, had been involved with Booth. But John Surratt fled to Canada and was not captured until 1867. When he was finally tried in a civilian court, the jury deadlocked and he was never retried. The contrast was stark. A military commission had condemned his mother to death, while a civilian jury could not even reach a verdict against her son. This is not to say that Mary Surratt was innocent. She may well have known about the plot, but the trial did not prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And the use of perjured testimony tainted the entire proceeding. So where does this leave us? The assassination investigation was controlled by one man, Edwin Stanton. The trial was conducted before a military commission. The evidence was manipulated. The government's star witness was a perjurer. And the records were sealed for decades. These facts do not prove that Stanton orchestrated the assassination, but they do prove that the investigation was deeply flawed, and they explain why conspiracy theories have flourished. The next question is, why did Stanton behave this way? Was he simply a paranoid official trying to control a chaotic situation, or was he concealing something more sinister? Historian Thomas R. Turner has argued that Stanton's actions were understandable in the context of April 1865. The city was in chaos. The government was paralyzed. Stanton took charge because no one else would. Many of his contemporaries praised him for his decisiveness. Most did not believe he was trying to become a dictator. They believed he had done an excellent job under circumstances that were almost unimaginable. But the defense of Stanton does not explain everything. It does not explain why he ordered the telegraph records destroyed. It does not explain why he prevented certain witnesses from testifying. It does not explain why the military commission's proceedings were so secretive. And it does not explain why the files were sealed for 80 years. The most charitable interpretation is that Stanton was trying to protect the government from embarrassment. Lincoln's death was a catastrophic failure of security. Stanton had been responsible for security. He had every reason to control the narrative. But there is a less charitable interpretation, that Stanton was protecting himself. This is the central mystery at the heart of the Lincoln assassination, and it brings us to the most controversial theory of all, the theory that Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was not just the investigator, but the mastermind. In 1937, a book was published that changed everything. Its title was Why Was Lincoln Murdered? Its author was Otto Eisenschimmel, a chemist by training and a Civil War enthusiast by obsession. And its central argument was simple but explosive. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was not just the investigator of Lincoln's assassination, he was the mastermind behind it. Eisenschimmel's book became a phenomenon. It was a Book of the Month Club selection. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It was serialized in magazines and debated on the radio. For a generation of Americans, Eisenschimmel's questions became the questions. Why was Lincoln denied the protection he requested? Why did the telegraph fail at the exact moment of the assassination? Why did Booth's diary have 18 missing pages? Bot. The book presented itself not as a conclusion, but as an investigation. Eisenschimmel claimed he was simply asking the questions that historians had ignored. He documented his findings with footnotes. He sounded like a scientist, and he built a case that seemed almost impossible to refute. Here was his argument. First, Lincoln had requested that Major Thomas Eckert, a trusted War Department officer, accompany him to Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th. Stanton refused the request. And then, when Lincoln asked again, Stanton refused again. Why would Stanton deny the president a protector he wanted? Second, On the night of the assassination, there was a mysterious 2-hour interruption of the telegraph lines from Washington to Baltimore. This meant that the government could not communicate with the outside world during the crucial hours after the shooting, and since Stanton controlled the telegraph office, he could have ordered that interruption. Third, Booth's escape route through southern Maryland was left unpatrolled. Stanton's telegrams to block the roads mentioned every route, except the one Booth actually took. It was almost as if Stanton wanted Booth to escape. Fourth, Booth was shot and killed at Garrett's farm, despite orders to take him alive. Eisenschimmel argued that Stanton had Booth killed, so he could not reveal the full conspiracy. Boston Corbett, the soldier who fired the fatal shot, was 30 feet away from the barn, too far for an accurate shot. Perhaps someone else had fired, or perhaps Corbett had been ordered to shoot to kill. Fifth, the accused conspirators were kept hooded during their imprisonment and trial. Why would Stanton want to prevent them from seeing or speaking to anyone, unless he feared they might reveal the truth about his involvement? And sixth, Booth's diary was missing 18 pages. The diary had been delivered to Stanton immediately after Booth's death. Stanton kept it hidden for 2 years before turning it over to the government. What was on those missing pages? Were they evidence that Stanton had orchestrated the assassination? Eisenschimmel's case was circumstantial, and he admitted as much. In his final summary, he wrote, "There is not one point in this summary that can be proven. It is all hypothesis. In view of all facts known at this time, an indictment against Stanton cannot be sustained for lack of material evidence." But that caveat was buried at the end of a book that had spent hundreds of pages incriminating Stanton. It was too little, too late. The book's influence was enormous. Within a generation, a majority of Americans who had an opinion on the assassination believed that Stanton had been involved, or at least that he had covered something up. The thesis was expanded upon by a parade of popular writers, journalists, and filmmakers. In 1977, the book The Lincoln Conspiracy and its accompanying film claimed to have discovered the missing pages of Booth's diary, pages that supposedly implicated Stanton and dozens of other government officials. But there were problems with that claim. The authors of The Lincoln Conspiracy had not actually seen the diary pages. They had been shown only a transcript, and the transcript had been provided by a man named Ray Neff, a professor whose previous historical discoveries had been exposed as fabrications. The story of the missing pages was widely debunked. The original diary is still on display at Ford's Theatre, its missing pages still missing. But not a shred of credible evidence has ever linked those missing pages to Stanton. Yet the popularity of the Eisenschimmel thesis persisted. Why? Partly because it feeds a deep human hunger for conspiracy. The idea that a powerful man orchestrated the murder of a beloved president is more compelling than the idea that one fanatic acted alone, and partly because the mystery was never fully resolved. The military trial was deeply flawed. The perjury scandal tainted the evidence. The questions Eisenschimmel raised were not unreasonable, even if his answers were wrong. So what do historians say today about Eisenschimmel's claims? Most have rejected them entirely. Each of his suspicious turns out to have a reasonable explanation. The telegraph interruption? It was only the commercial telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore. The military lines remained open, and Stanton was in constant communication with commanders throughout the night. The unpatrolled escape route? There were no telegraphic facilities along the route Booth took through southern Maryland. Stanton could not order troops to block it because he had no way to communicate with them. He did, however, send warnings to the nearest naval stations. And if Booth had not broken his leg at the theater, he would have been deep into Virginia before anyone even knew he was gone. Booth shot. The soldiers had been ordered to capture him alive. Boston Corbett fired because he saw Booth raising a weapon. Corbett acted on his own, not on Stanton's orders, and Booth remained conscious for hours after being shot. He had plenty of time to incriminate Stanton if he wanted to, but he never did. The hooded prisoners? They were hooded for a few weeks, but they were not silenced. Each was interrogated repeatedly. Those who survived prison had decades to tell their stories. None of them ever incriminated Stanton. And those missing diary pages? They may simply have been used for notes during Booth's escape, or they may never have contained anything incriminating at all. The great conspiracy theory, in the end, was built on a foundation of speculation and misinterpretation. Historian William Hanchett, who spent years analyzing Eisenschimmel's work, called it malicious fiction. The historians who reviewed the book in 1937 dismissed it as an advocate's brief rather than a judicious effort to discover truth. But here is the final irony. Even though Eisenschimmel's theory was wrong, it forced historians to ask better questions. It exposed the weaknesses in the military trial. It highlighted the perjury scandal. It made clear that Stanton had manipulated the investigation, not to cover up a murder plot, but to protect his own political interests. In that sense, Eisenschimmel did not uncover the true origin of the assassination. But he did expose something else, the willingness of the powerful to shape the historical narrative for their own purposes. And that brings us to the final act of our investigation. Because if Stanton did not orchestrate the assassination, then who did? The answer lies not in a government conspiracy, but in something far deeper and far more disturbing. By the late 20th century, a new generation of historians had emerged to challenge the grand conspiracy theories. They were not apologists for Stanton. They were not defenders of the military trial. They were scholars who believed in the evidence and who had spent years studying the primary sources. And their conclusions were devastating to the Eisenschimmel thesis. The most prominent of these scholars was William Hanchett, whose book, The Lincoln Murder Conspiracies, remains the definitive study of assassination historiography. Hanchett did not set out to defend Stanton. He set out to understand why the conspiracy theories had flourished, and what he discovered was that the evidence for a Stanton-led plot was virtually non-existent. Hanchett pointed out that Eisenschimmel's book was not history. It was a work of advocacy. It cherry-picked evidence, ignored counter-arguments, and presented speculation as fact. Hanchett wrote that Eisenschimmel's interpretation of the evidence accepted as fact every derogatory assertion about Stanton, regardless of the source, while rejecting anything that might be construed as favorable. It was not a balanced investigation. It was a prosecution brief. Another historian, Michael W. Kaufman, who wrote American Brutus, one of the most respected biographies of Booth, reached a similar conclusion. Kaufman argued that Booth was not a pawn of a grand conspiracy. He was a fanatic who acted on his own. Booth's plan was shaped by his own obsessions, not by orders from Richmond or Washington. Kaufman demonstrated that Booth had been planning the kidnapping for months, but the assassination was an improvisation, the act of a desperate man who saw the Confederacy slipping away. Kaufman also showed that the evidence against Stanton was based on misunderstandings. The missing telegraph records? They had been destroyed as a matter of routine. The interruption of the telegraph lines? It was almost certainly accidental. The claim that Stanton wanted Booth to escape? It defies logic. Stanton was desperate to capture Booth. He offered enormous rewards. He organized the largest manhunt in American history. If he had wanted Booth to escape, he would not have done any of these things. Perhaps the most devastating rebuttal came from historian Edward Steers Jr., whose book, Blood on the Moon, carefully re-examined the evidence. Steers concluded that Booth was the sole mastermind of the assassination. He had access to Confederate agents, but he was not their puppet. He had money from Confederate sources, but he used it to fund his own plot. The assassination was not part of a government conspiracy. It was the act of one man and his small circle of allies. Steers also addressed the question of the missing diary pages. The diary had been published in 1865, but the pages were missing because Booth had torn them out during his escape to write notes, not because Stanton had removed incriminating evidence. When Stanton finally released the diary, it contained nothing that implicated him. If the diary had contained evidence against Stanton, Steers argued, Stanton would have destroyed it entirely. He would not have released it at all. The fact that he released it, with pages missing, suggests that those pages were not important. So what explains the enduring popularity of conspiracy theories? Historians have offered several explanations. First, the public is naturally drawn to dramatic narratives. The idea that one man, acting alone, could kill a president is unsatisfying. It feels too simple. The public prefers a story of shadowy cabals, secret meetings, and hidden forces. Second, the irregularities of the military trial created a deep suspicion that something was being covered up. And third, the perjury scandal, which was never fully resolved, has continued to nourish doubts. But the orthodox historians have answers for these concerns. The military trial was irregular, they admit, but that does not mean it was unjust. The accused were tried in a time of war, when ordinary legal protections were suspended. The public was demanding swift justice. The government acted accordingly, and while the trial was flawed, the fundamental guilt of the defendants was not in doubt. Booth's co-conspirators were not innocent victims. They were active participants in a plot to kill the president. Their convictions were justified. As for the perjury scandal, it does not mean the entire case was built on lies. Conover's testimony was one piece of evidence among many. The other witnesses were credible. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The government did not rely solely on Conover. The perjury conviction embarrassed the government, but it did not invalidate the verdict. Hanchett, Kaufman, Steers, and other orthodox historians do not deny that Stanton was a flawed figure. He was ruthless, ambitious, and manipulative. He did attempt to control the narrative. He did use the trial for political purposes. He did have a strained relationship with Lincoln, but none of this proves that he orchestrated the assassination. It proves only that he was a complicated man who saw the assassination as an opportunity to consolidate his power. In fact, Hanchett has argued that Stanton was the first victim of the conspiracy theories. His reputation was damaged by Eisenschimmel's accusations. He became a scapegoat for an event that he had not caused. Stanton was guilty of many things, but he was not guilty of killing Lincoln. The orthodox interpretation is now the dominant view among historians. It is taught in universities, it appears in textbooks, it is the standard narrative. And yet, the conspiracy theories have never fully disappeared. They persist because the questions they raise have never been fully answered. Why did Stanton destroy the telegraph records? Why did he hood the prisoners? Why did he keep the diary hidden for 2 years? Why was the trial so secretive? These questions are not unreasonable, and they bring us to the final, most difficult part of our investigation. If Stanton did not orchestrate the assassination, then what was the true origin of the Lincoln assassination? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is not a shadowy cabal. It is something far simpler, far more disturbing, and far more revealing about American history. The answer lies in Booth's own words, and in those words we find the true cause of Lincoln's murder, a cause that historians have often overlooked in their obsession with Stanton and the conspiracies. Booth was not killed by a conspiracy. He was driven by an ideology. And that ideology was not just his own. It was shared by millions of Americans, Southerners who believed that slavery was a sacred institution, Northerners who feared the consequences of emancipation, and political leaders who were unwilling to accept the end of white supremacy. The assassination was not just the act of one man, it was the final act of a society that was willing to kill to preserve its racial hierarchy. This is the true origin of the Lincoln assassination, not Stanton, not the Confederacy, not a grand conspiracy, but the unwillingness of the American system to confront its deepest sin, slavery, and the willingness of its defenders to kill to protect it. So after all the investigations, all the conspiracy theories, all the perjured testimony and missing diary pages, what is the truth? What is the true origin of the Lincoln assassination? The answer is not Stanton. It is not a shadowy cabal of Confederate agents. It is not a government cover-up. The answer is written in Booth's own words, in his diary, in his letters, and in the statements he made to friends and family in the months before April 14. Booth killed Abraham Lincoln because Lincoln had emancipated the slaves. That is the simple, undeniable truth. Everything else, the conspiracy theories, the speculation about Stanton, the questions about Confederate involvement, distracts us from this central fact. Booth was a white supremacist who believed that slavery was a divine institution. He believed that black Americans were inferior and that emancipation would destroy the white race. He believed that Lincoln was a tyrant who had betrayed the South, and he was willing to die to stop him. Consider Booth's own words. In his diary, written during his flight from Washington, he justified his actions by invoking the cause of the Confederacy. He wrote that he had done what he believed was right. He wrote that history would vindicate him. He wrote that he was a martyr for the cause of white supremacy. These are not the words of a man driven by a conspiracy. They are the words of a fanatic driven by an ideology. Booth was not alone in this belief. He was part of a broader movement that rejected equality, rejected emancipation, and rejected the very idea of a multiracial democracy. Millions of Southerners shared his views. Many Northerners did as well. The assassination was not the act of one man. It was the final explosion of a society that had built its wealth and power on the backs of enslaved people and was willing to kill to preserve that system. Historians have often overlooked this truth because they have been distracted by the conspiracy theories. They have spent decades debating whether Stanton was involved, whether the Confederates orchestrated the plot, whether Booth was a pawn or a mastermind. But in doing so, they have lost sight of the deeper cause. The assassination was not about politics. It was not about power. It was about race. It was about the unwillingness of the American system to confront its deepest sin. This is why the Lincoln assassination still matters today. It is not just a historical event, it is a warning. It reminds us that democracy is fragile, that racial hatred is a powerful force, and that the consequences of unresolved injustice can echo across generations. Lincoln himself understood this. In his second inaugural address, delivered just 6 weeks before his death, He spoke of the war as a divine punishment for the sin of slavery. He said, "The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh." Lincoln knew that the war was a judgment on a nation that had allowed slavery to flourish, and he knew that the struggle was not over. Booth attended that speech. He stood in the crowd and listened to Lincoln's words, and what he heard only confirmed his hatred. Lincoln was not calling for reconciliation. He was calling for a reckoning, and Booth could not accept that. So he killed the president. Not because of a conspiracy, not because of orders from Richmond, but because he believed that Lincoln's vision of a multiracial democracy was a threat to everything he held dear. He killed Lincoln to preserve a system of racial domination that had existed for centuries, and in doing so, he became the final embodiment of that system's desperate, violent resistance. The true origin of the Lincoln assassination, then, is not a mystery. It is a tragedy. It is the tragedy of a nation that was unwilling to confront its deepest injustice until it was forced to. And it is the tragedy of a president who paid the ultimate price for trying to lead his country toward a more just future. But there is another truth that historians have often missed. The assassination did not stop the cause of freedom, it accelerated it. Lincoln's death became a rallying cry for the radical Republicans who pushed through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The assassination helped to ensure that slavery was abolished, that Black Americans received citizenship, and that the Constitution was amended to guarantee equal protection under the law. In a strange and tragic way, Booth's bullet did not destroy Lincoln's legacy. It secured it. So what should we remember about the assassination? We should remember that it was not a conspiracy. It was not a government plot. It was the act of one man, driven by an ideology, who was willing to kill to preserve a system of racial domination. And we should remember that the struggle that Lincoln began, the struggle for justice, equality, and a multiracial democracy, is not over. It continues today. The bullet that killed Lincoln was fired by John Wilkes Booth, but the trigger was pulled by the institution Booth was willing to die for, slavery, and the echo of that shot is still being heard today.